Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook video for today, Tuesday, June 25th, 2024. Starting off with the National Hurricane Center page, going over what is going on in the Atlantic right now and any areas, and something fell, but we're going to ignore it. Any areas of interest we have, and indeed we do, in the Caribbean, as we've been talking about for the last several days. A low chance of development right now, but as we talked about, a tropical wave now moved into the Caribbean. It is a very amplified tropical wave, and as it moves into the central and western Caribbean and into the southern Gulf of Mexico by the end of the week, it might have a chance to potentially develop and become another system. But besides this, I'm very certain that pretty soon we might also have another area of interest to watch out here in the actual MDR that could actually develop in the main development region east of the Caribbean islands as we head into late this week and into potentially next week as well. Although we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But taking a look at the satellite image in the Atlantic right now, you can see that wave, the culprit of what we're watching for in the Atlantic, and you can see there it is, very strong in the Eastern Caribbean, lots of convective activity associated with it, although you can see that it is moving at a very fast pace. And there's also probably some shear with it as well. But there is a tropical wave. There is definitely some energy in the atmosphere that is there for potentially some development as we move into the central and western Caribbean. Besides that, across the Atlantic, we have lots of Saharan air. That obviously will keep a lid on things for now, but maybe once again, as I said, we have this area to watch in the Caribbean. This might try to get going potentially. Depends on how close to Central America it stays, how much the ridge over the United States will suppress this storm to where it kind of stays over Central America or not. And then we also have, as I mentioned, you notice these waves coming off of Africa. These might actually be of interest potentially later this week and early next week in the central western MDR, potentially close to the islands too, that we might need to watch. That some of these waves that we see right now, very amplified waves and very strong waves coming off of Africa, the models are potentially hinting at development, although we have lots of Saharan air right now. And obviously nothing is exactly expected to develop right now. You can see on the Saharan air map, lots of dust coming off of Africa. Definitely the main reason why we're really not seeing these tropical waves exploding and becoming these monster hurricanes yet is because of all the Saharan air we have in the MDR right now. But it is typical of the early season. We tend to get these dust waves that come off of Africa anyways. This is something that I mentioned many times before, as you know, but I'll continue to mention it again. We really don't see the Saharan air sort of situation really die down until we get to late July and early August. Although sometimes there's been some years where it really has taken till late August for the Saharan air to fully die down. But regardless, it's going to depend on how amplified these waves are in the MDR. One thing is for sure is that if we look at the sea surface temperatures, it's definitely not an issue. Well, this is not showing the MDR, but at least in terms of the wave that we have in the Caribbean right now, conditions-wise, and this also applies for the MDR too, very warm sea surface temperatures, widespread throughout the entire basin. At least in the Caribbean, you could see widespread widespread, not anomalies, these are actual sea surface temperatures, but readings solidly widespread throughout the entire Caribbean, 29 degrees Celsius, even some 28s as we get into the Gulf, but also mostly 29s as well, especially in the Bay of Campeche, even on the heels of getting Alberto and the other invests we had several days ago. It is still very warm. 29 degrees Celsius is mid to upper 80s, and that is still lots of ample energy in the ocean for potential tropical systems to take advantage of, especially if they're not going to be huge systems. Plus the fact that there's already lots of upper ocean heat content, basically very warm sea surface temperatures, and depths to the warmth in this ocean that extends well below the surface. That's what upper ocean heat content basically is. It's very ample throughout this region, and in general, things are just very favorable, and that is definitely a plus in favor of potentially things developing And I guess, at least in terms of things developing out here in the eastern MDR, that could help it work against or try to work in direct combat with this huge Saharan air plume that we have coming off of Africa right now. So we'll have to see, but I'll show you the models in just a bit to see just exactly what they show. But the other aspect of this too is the fact that this is all coming right when we basically said that the atmosphere would become more favorable in the Atlantic. We've basically been talking about it since early June, that the atmosphere in the Atlantic would generally become more favorable for tropical development. And we're talking about the velocity potential, of course. And the main way that I would suggest to read this map is the oranges and the yellows represent sinking air in the atmosphere. Generally, not where you would expect lots of convective activity or rising motion. And then the greens and the blues, obviously, is the opposite. And where you notice right now in the map in the Atlantic, we're right now in all of those greens, all the way up from now till the early part of next month, meaning the atmosphere will potentially be primed for development to occur in the Atlantic. And of course, we're in that phase now, which is, of course, why we're seeing all of these sort of signals begin to pop up. And it does seem to last roughly into the early part of next month, aka probably into the next week or so, before we start to see these browns and oranges make their way into the Atlantic. And that's probably around mid-July, when maybe things will probably quiet down a little bit afterward. But you can see all of this kind of more favorable atmospheric conditions being reflected, at least in terms of the European ensembles. You could see lots of activity on the European ensembles, and this is one of the few models that we sometimes look at when it comes to development. I really like to look at ensembles when we're looking at the big picture in terms of general development areas to watch in the Atlantic. I think the European ensembles is great at kind of outlining all the areas, and you can see the Caribbean. You can definitely see where the National Hurricane Center area is highlighted right through the Yucatan and the Southern Gulf, and then in the MDR too, especially as we head towards the last day or so of June and then into the early first few days of July. Notice how the MDR really begins to light up in terms of development. And you could almost see two areas that are kind of noted on the EPS. We have one low pressure that develops from the central MDR. You can see that right now. And then you notice after that another low pressure area too. So maybe we might have multiple areas of interest to watch. That's at least what the European is showing. What about the GFS? So we have the 12Z GFS. It's kind of nice. You could kind of put side by side two models to kind of represent what is going on. And let's do that with the 12Z GFS. Kind of take it out into time. Next 3 days, not much going on, although you can see that there's that energy that we're watching in the Western Caribbean. As I mentioned, though, it's kind of going to be an issue on whether or not we have this huge ridge over the northern Gulf of Mexico that will suppress it enough into Central America where it might not develop at all. And I guess the 12Z GFS kind of highlights that case scenario. But regardless, it is still energy that needs to be watched. And of course, we could see whether or not the models will uptrend or downtrend in potentially shifting things a little bit further north enough that it tries to develop. But really quickly, let me kind of zoom it back and notice on the right-hand side, notice what's happening near the Caribbean islands here. We see what seems to be a very small but very bona fide, probably tropical system at this point. You notice the closed isobar, so there's probably a tight low-level center within this system, and you can notice also the very tight vorticity too, especially as it heads into the Caribbean. So maybe as we head into next week, we might need to watch for a potential tropical threat into the Caribbean islands, although the GFS eventually, as it traverses the Caribbean, kind of dies out and then opens back up into a wave. That's kind of typical this time of year when we get things that develop in the MDR. After a while, probably because of the very strong trades that we have throughout the deep tropics this time of year, sometimes the trades are too strong that they can cause systems that develop into small tropical systems in the MDR to open up. And that's exactly what we see in the MDR, especially because it traverses through the Eastern Caribbean, which is very known for being kind of like a graveyard area. If you're a hurricane tracker, you know what I mean. But if you're not a hurricane tracker, We call the Eastern Caribbean, in terms of tropical cyclone development, we tend to call it a graveyard, because storms, especially small storms that are developing in the MDR, if they're developing systems, or if they're not already well developed tropical systems, by the time they reach the Eastern Caribbean, a lot of the times they end up dying out, and opening back up into waves. Or if they're only developing, they probably struggle until they get to the Central and Western Caribbean. There is actually an atmospheric sort of component to it, and I think it has to be related to how the dynamic works with trades and in relation to South America, which is obviously in the southern portion of the Caribbean, or at least the northern extent of South America. I think there's some sort of actual scientific thing behind it, but in general, we just call it the Caribbean graveyard. And you could see it in full action on the GFS. We kind of see something move into the Caribbean, and then once it gets into the Caribbean, it just dies out and opens back up into a tropical wave. And then, meanwhile, this is beyond the time frame we really look at. This is already 8-9 days out on the GFS. But you notice, finally, the GFS is starting to show potentially some development occur in the Eastern Pacific. I'd imagine as we get more of these amplified tropical waves that get going in the Atlantic, not all of them will develop, of course, in the MDR. So I'd imagine a few of them will probably traverse into the Eastern Pacific and probably get a chance to develop then. I mean, the Eastern Pacific is overdue. They're basically on track for their latest start on record. We've not had a named storm yet in the Eastern Pacific. And let's actually really quickly go to the Eastern Pacific now that I've thought about it. And even over the next 7 days, nothing really much happening at all. You can see actually the area stays in the Caribbean and kind of doesn't develop much. But I guess maybe what the GFS is showing as we get towards that longer range, maybe it is that energy that we're watching for the Caribbean and Gulf right now. Maybe if it doesn't develop in the Bay of Campeche or whatever, energy of it kind of moves south into the Eastern Pacific, and the GFS eventually in the long range ends up developing it. So we'll see. Maybe the Eastern Pacific is on track to potentially get their first storm soon enough, soonish. But by the time we're talking already of all this happening, it'll probably already be late next week. And it'll already be into early July, which would indeed be their latest start on record in the Eastern Pacific. But regardless of that, really quickly, let's move out into the MDR and see what else happens. You can see we have that strong wave. Yeah, we do, right there. And there's actually another wave that maybe amplifies, although this is really short term. But we have that strong wave that the GFS tries to develop. Seems like it starts really getting going around the four-ish day mark. So I'm pretty sure in terms of National Hurricane Center, as I said before earlier on, we have this area of interest in the MDR, probably going to get another one out here within the next day or so. Probably wouldn't surprise me, in fact, if they start marking this area tomorrow. And then notice that behind that wave, we also have another wave that tries to get going on the GFS, although is not as successful probably. But you get the general picture. Things start getting amplified in the MDR. We start looking further east. And it kind of does correspond a little bit to climatology as well, really quickly before we kind of wrap this up. As we head out, as we close out the month of June, as we start getting into early July, we always talk about how June typically tends to be the area that we watch predominantly the Caribbean and Gulf, and generally areas that are closer to where we are in the Atlantic for development early on in June. Well, we still see that predominantly that's where we look in terms of development in general in the Atlantic. But notice as well, as we head towards the first 10 days of July at least, we do start getting some sort of action that occurs, especially in the central to western portions of the MDR. So potentially some sort of formation occurring in the MDR over the next week definitely starts to, you could generally put the pieces together that obviously we're starting to see things fall in line. Definitely does also fall in line as well with this year potentially being a very active hurricane season. So when you put that into play, all this kind of happening, or at least all these signals that we see. It's not set in stone yet that we will get development, but it makes sense given the general background state, very warm Atlantic, and now we're seeing the atmosphere actually corresponding to that too. You could generally understand why we're starting to get all these signals, and it looks like, as I said before, it looks like as we close out the month of June into July, we might have a few things to watch in the tropics. Although, once again, I do want to point out the fact it's not set in stone yet, and we still have a lot of waiting to see, whether in terms of what the models show and in terms of, what's going to stick and what the main focus should be in terms of these areas to watch. But they're all areas of interest. They're all things that we see on the models. And luckily we see them now instead of many years ago where we probably would have only seen them 1 or 2 days out already developing. Just a really kind of a testament to show technology. And it's honestly a blessing. And in some ways it might not seem like a blessing, sometimes especially what helped by social media, but in terms of forecasting and really being able to look in advance, a lot of these technologies like the models we have right now, to be able to see these kind of systems forming out well in advance, even further than a week, it really is a blessing, and it is really something that we take for granted right now. So definitely got to use it, although obviously, as always, too much of a good thing is a bad thing, and that's unfortunately something we see a lot. Don't overabuse it, is my point. And hopefully I don't do that. I try not to do that. But it's impossible to really not say something that as we head into July, it really looks like something is potentially on the cards for the Atlantic in one way or another. Anyways, enough of me rambling. Really, I hope you enjoyed today's video. As always, if you did, I always encourage you to like, comment, subscribe, share with family and friends as well. Get the word out. We're almost at 500 subscribers, by the way, which is a nice, little milestone. Obviously, it's not at all compared to other people, but we're not really in it for that. We're just in it to talk about the tropics. That's all I'm here for. Not worried about any of the other stuff, but it would be nice if you would help me out with that too. Just saying, just saying. But with that being said, have a great rest of your day. Have a blessed day as well. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to you all. We'll definitely be monitoring things when it comes to the tropics, and we will do that again tomorrow.